I had like a really crappy car with nothing in it, but someone had shattered the window. I was like, why would anyone do that? And then I tried to start it. And I was like, oh, shit.
Oh.
So they shattered the window to pop the trunk in order to get the battery.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. That's Car Talk with
Have you heard of
538.
Welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. My name is Jody Avirgan. It is a new week, and if anyone is relieved, it might be the folks at the White House. Last week was quite a whirlwind in terms of both staffing and policy. Hope Hicks is out. Trump spent some time skewering Jeff Sessions. Jared Kushner's security clearance got downgraded, and as far as policy went, Trump bucked the NRA on guns for at least a day, and then sort of went back and forth on guns, and then he started talking about how trade wars are easy to win. So there's a lot to talk about, and today we're going to focus on what that last week tells us about the White House's decision-making and the sort of way that they do statecraft. So here to have that conversation is politics writer Claire Malone. Hello, Claire.
Hey, Jody.
Politics editor Micah Cohen, to my right. Hello, Micah.
Hello.
And on the phone is politics writer Perry Bacon Jr. Hi, Perry.
Hi, guys.
And Nate is, we don't know where Nate is. He's traveling around this week.
I know where he is.
Okay, only Micah knows where he is. We'll see. I didn't mean it to be that mysterious. Nate's out this week. And later on, we're also going to talk about these newly released presidential rankings. We just published a piece this morning kind of looking at whether it's worthwhile to rank presidents and kind of some of the pitfalls of that, and particularly ranking current presidents. Before we do any of that, though, let's ask a question we like to ask from time to time. Good use of polling or bad use of polling? Our example this week comes from the early voting numbers in the Texas midterm primary. There's been a lot of headlines around this. I'm going to read one from NPR as a representative sample. It says, quote, Democrats see possible blue wave in Texas primary early voting. That's like a 538, cautionary buzzword jumble right there. Blue wave, early voting, possible. But nevertheless, let's talk about it. The numbers have shown that Democratic turnout in Texas topped GOP turnout after 8 days of early voting from February 20th to February 27th. It has already exceeded levels of Democratic primary turnout in 2016 and nearly doubled early turnout from the 2014 midterms. Micah, I'm sure your Twitter feed and just kind of the political world has you've seen this a lot. What do you make of all this buzz about the early turnout in Texas?
I don't make anything
really
of it.
People love talking about Texas.
It's like people love talking about Texas and early voting. For whatever reason, people love early voting. In 2016, we saw this too. People just grasp onto early voting as a thing. And look, it's not a thing. It's don't read into early voting. I feel like
it's flax. Feed this to people, and they're like, the early voting numbers are looking really good for our side, and then people have to write a story, and so they're like, well, I'll write a story about the early voting.
It does sound very convincing, right? It's let
me repeat that, just because it is kind of startling. Turnout for Democrats has already doubled turnout from 2014.
Okay, so
well, at some point, if there's going to be a massive wave, you're going to get the first sign of it. And so the question is always, what is the legit first sign of it? And maybe this is it. And I will also just add that, Dave Wasserman, who's a colleague of ours who we tend to who tends to be very cautious, I've noticed on his Twitter feed, he's sort of dipping some toes into saying this might be for real. I don't know if you kind of think Dave's getting out over his skis there. I don't know.
I might be wrong, but I don't think he was talking about early voting. I think he was talking about giving a better chance to Beto O'Rourke in Texas than he usually would. I think if I remember seeing that on Dave's feed. I don't remember seeing him say anything about early voting. But I do think Dave's point is, look, everyone. It's a longstanding joke for those listeners who are not in on it that the Democrats are going to turn Texas blue this time, and it's it's become sort of this almost like the perpetual infrastructure week joke. Except it's been going on for 10 years.
That's not a
it's a joke for Claire.
That's a Claire joke. Yeah.
But basically, a lot of people think that that's hogwash. But Dave was trying to say, actually, this potential blue wave or demi wave, whatever we decided to call it a while back, it could affect Texas and it could make races in Texas tighter. But I don't think he was talking about early voting. I think he was talking about the race overall.
I saw this great tweet, which was written on March 4th, saying, anyone have any statistical proof that turnout in Texas primaries actually matters for November, or tell us anything beyond what we already know? DM slated to do well. I'm genuinely curious. it was funny only because this person has in his Twitter feed, he calls himself the forecaster. So people immediately were like, "Are you the forecaster? Don't you know the answer to this question?" And I think the answer is Harry doesn't know. I don't know, and I think Mike is right. We don't really know much from these early numbers that tell us anything. But everyone thinks Texas is going to turn bluer, or maybe the Democrats will have a few more House races in Texas. So I think that's a reasonable thing, just not based on these early numbers. I think it's more based on the polls that show Beto pretty close and Trump doing poorly in the suburbs around Houston.
Yeah, that's key. So let's put some fine points on this. One, don't read into early voting. It just hasn't been around long enough for us to reliably say what it means. So Democratic turnout is doubled what it was in 2014. We don't know if that's a meaningful signal because it just hasn't, early voting hasn't been around long enough. The other point, what Perry just said, is really important, which is we already had signs that the Democrats were going to do really well in 2018. Special elections, the generic ballot, all types of other, Trump's approval rating. So in the sense that this points in the same direction, maybe I'll pay a little more attention to it. But everybody freaked out about early voting in 2016, and with the exception of Nevada, they were basically wrong across the board. The other, just one more thing, is Harry actually looked at how much in presidential elections the primary vote predicts the general election vote, and the answer is it doesn't really, So this is just, it's not a use of polling, but people need to stop doing this.
Or actually, it's not a use of polling, which is kind of our point, that there are polls out there. We tend to say wait for the polls, wait for the good polls, wait for there to be a sort of critical mass of polls, and that's still a few months away, right? I mean, it's early.
Yeah, and if you want to think of the early vote as a form of a poll, sure, but then you really you don't have enough polls, basically.
Right, that's a good point. Okay, so let's leave it there, and we're going to move on and get on to our first segment. But first, let me ask you a brief question. Are you hiring? Every business needs great people, and a better way to find them. Something better than posting your job online and praying for the right people to use it. Well, ZipRecruiter has revolutionized that practice. Their hiring technology finds great candidates for you. It learns what you're looking for, identifies people with the right experience, and invites them to apply to your job. Right now, you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/538. You don't have to spell it out like you do on our website, just the numbers, 538. That's ZipRecruiter.com/538. They were able to get the
just
URL.
The numbers, jeez.
We weren't even able to get that. ZipRecruiter.com/538. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Okay, let's get into our first segment, which is a look at turnover in the Trump White House as departures of notable aides continue. And I think we should talk about this less as the sort of palace intrigue stuff and more as a way to think about Trump's inner circle, the people advising him, and what it says about decision-making around important issues in the Trump White House. So Trump's been president for, 13 months now or so? There's been enough turnover, as it happens, to maybe have a little data, build a little data set. So, Micah, let's look at the numbers. How do those stack up? How does turnover in the Trump White House compare to previous White Houses?
It's higher.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Good top line.
You can look at a lot of different things. So let's start at the top. If you look at Trump's cabinet, I think he's had, Perry, is it 3 or 4 cabinet level departures so far?
Tom Price at HHS. I'm trying to think of other cabinet. The chief of staff is a cabinet level person.
Priebus, Price. Oh, and I guess Kelly technically counts because he left home. In any case, if you look at all recent administrations, pretty much none of them had anybody in their cabinet or cabinet level official leave in the first year. Trump, depending on how you count, has had a handful, right? Then you look at just, widen that out to sort of just general high-profile staff, and it just feels like maybe every other week there's somebody leaving, right? So, it's a little squishy in terms of the exact numbers, but, you can look at individual positions. Quartz had this great graphic of Trump's communication chiefs and how long they served compared to Obama's. And Obama actually had his first 2, Ellen Moran and Anita Dunn, served 92 days and 224 days, respectively. And then you had people serve, a year, 2 years, etc. Here's Trump's. Sean Spicer, 46 days. Mike Dubke, 86 days. Sean Spicer, take 2, 53 days. Scaramucci, 11 days. Hope Hicks, 197 days. So That's an average of 78.6 days per.
Legit forgotten about Mike Dubke.
Me
Like that was a
too.
name that was just not in my brain before the instant before you read it out loud. So I think this is a scenario where, like, listeners, if you were feeling like there's a lot of turnover, yes, there's a lot of turnover.
The numbers
we can
back
trust.
that up. Yeah.
We can trust that. So let's talk about what the actual effect of that is. Our colleagues Amelia and Andrea recently wrote a piece that I think it came out last week that was sort of like a rubric for evaluating these departures and sort of asking a question that I'll pose to you, Claire, which is, does every time there's a departure, is it necessarily a sign of trouble, or could it mean something else?
Yeah, in their piece, they talked a bit about what departures mean, usually in sort of business structures, and they were making the point that the federal government, a lot of agencies expect senior officials to leave. But I think the Trump scenario is different because in many cases, it seems like the high-level departures come not just with, okay, this is turnover, but there have perhaps been a lot of projects implemented. You could look at a place like the State Department where, yes, Rex Tillerson is purposely starving some parts of the State Department, but in other ways, he's not really making a lot of moves there. There's a certain sense of, in the Trump White House, the Trump administration, there's perhaps enough turnover that it doesn't just affect the siloed out portions that person who was running something has now left. It affects the general tenor, office morale, and cohesiveness when it comes to what is the agenda of President Trump and his administration. What are they trying to accomplish? In a lot of ways, I think we're seeing, in some ways, maybe because of all these departures, that congressional leaders have a whole lot of power nowadays. And I'm not saying it's the end of the imperial presidency, but I will say that it's certainly a lot of the lack of clear vision does give members of Congress, particularly Republicans, a lot more leeway and power to push up against the executive, which you have not seen a lot in recent years and decades.
So I definitely want to get us to that. But staying on the White House itself, Perry, I feel like this Michael Wolff book that came out a couple months ago gave us a little bit of a sense of how decision-making took place within the White House. Now every time there's a departure, we kind of like get a little bit more of a sense of the taxonomy and all the different roles. So can you paint a picture of like how decisions get made within a White House now, if ultimately it is about sort of this as an operational vehicle?
Well, it would depend so much on what the decision is. I mean, from a speech to a chair. I mean, I guess the thing I would say about this particular departure we saw last week is that I think Micah was referring to it. I think Obama had 5 communications directors in 8 years. Hope Hicks' replacement will be Trump's 5th. Her departure was not as surprising to me in that a lot of people who worked on Obama's campaign for those 2 years and then worked at the White House for 2 years, they had done sort of 4 years in Obama world and they moved on. That seems like so Hope left in 3 years, but my guess is 3 years in Trump world is equivalent to 4 or maybe 8 years of Obama world. So that was not necessarily that surprising to me. I mean, the communications director for Trump, I'm not totally sure. I think he directs communications. I'm not sure how much influence he had. I mean, part of the story here with Hope Hicks was that Trump has this very weird way of dealing with reporters where he has a communications department, but if you knew Hope Hicks well and you talked to Hope Hicks and said, hey, I want to talk to Trump, she gets on the phone with Trump pretty quickly. So a lot of reporters are sort of invested in her as someone who was helpful to them in a certain way, and I think that's important. But in terms of like how Trump tweets, which is a big part of his communications, I'm not sure that'll change a lot with Hope Hicks moving on.
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing. And I think part of the reason that we are more, or I don't know if this is true, it feels like the media, including us, are more focused on the staffing in Trump's White House than we have been in past administrations because Trump is so unpredictable and his thinking is such a black box in a lot of ways. It's actually the opposite of a black box. It's like his thinking is so transparent that it ends up being somewhat inscrutable, right? But we end up, Perry and I talked a lot right after inauguration, and Perry, I think we kind of had the assumption, which I think has been right, that because Trump was so inexperienced and had such unformed policy positions, that his staffing would be more important than for past administrations. Is that?
I still think that's true.
I think that's true.
I mean, like Scott Pruitt has more power than I would argue the average EPA person, because I'm not sure Trump has any views on the EPA that are, particularly relevant.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that there are sort of 2 levels to staffing in the Trump administration. One, there are these intellectual centers, so the Scott Pruitts, the Sessions, the Mick Mulvaney's of Trump world. And those are the people that has, going back to my point about people grabbing more power now that there's not a president with sort of this strong vision per se. So there are those people, the intellectual centers, those are, those exist and those are important because they want to pull Trump in different ideological ways. And then I think due to the president's mercurial temperament and his sort of capricious way of doing business, there are the people that are sort of the stabilizing staff members. And I think those people are, Kushner to some extent because he's family, but who knows right now.
Yeah.
But I think Hicks was emblematic of that, the idea that Trump is a peculiar kind of person who needs these people to basically be like his gravity blanket. Are you guys familiar with the concept of a gravity blanket? I just learned about it this weekend.
Really?
A weighted blanket?
Wonderful.
A gravity blanket is like a weighted blanket that's like constantly, when you put it on, it's like someone giving you a constant hug and it makes you calm down.
It's very relaxing.
So I kind of think Trump needs a certain...
A hug.
Jared Kushner is Trump's
gravity blanket.
Okay,
Yeah.
but so let me ask you, though, because I think the Kushner thing, to your point, is really interesting in that I think regardless of whether you like Trump or not, stabilizing forces are good inside a White House. Does the loss of Hicks and then Kushner now losing his security clearance, maybe being on the outs, but also just kind of like having less information about really important decisions, should that be worrisome? How much of that gravity blanket is left for Donald Trump?
Well, I think that as we see, the Post had an article, what was it, Micah? You linked to this yesterday, today, sometime in the last couple of days that talked about Trump's mood was terrible last week, and as the Post reports, that's the reason why he went out and started the trade war. He went a lot of different directions on guns because no one was there, kind of whispering in his ear, "Okay, take it easy on this or that." So, if you believe the Post reporting on that, which they say that they talked to 22 people with knowledge of the situation, that Trump was in sort of an erratic mood last week. So maybe.
No, so yeah, maybe. But this is where I think
I just like the idea of acting out through a trade war.
Yeah, but well, I mean, that might be what's happening. But this is, Perry should speak to this more than me. But this is where I think staffing stories get into trouble. So I'm all for okay, Hope Hicks leaves. How do we think that will affect White House decision making, right? But how many times during this administration have we read a story that's like the mood in the White House is at a nadir? And
I was actually thinking that as I was reading it. I was like, how many ways have they written
But
this
I just don't
Right.
I just don't know if those are different questions, particularly in this White House, because we've seen that the line between Trump's mood and his decision making is not as long as it is, and not as attenuated as it is for a lot of other presidents.
I guess what I'd say is I'd draw a distinction between policy and behavior. So I think Claire's totally right that on policy, Trump leaves vacuums that other people fill, whether it's Mulvaney or Pruitt or whoever, right? On behavior, this idea that Hope Hicks or Kushner or Ivanka, wherever or have ever been stabilizing forces, I'm just not sure what the evidence is for that. They've been with him since the beginning, and since the beginning, Trump has been all over the place. So, I don't, I just don't, I don't know where that comes from.
This idea that I respect people to Post, but Trump has been talking about tariffs and changing tariff policy for decades. So the idea that he may have done the actual policy in an erratic way this week, but he's been wanting to impose tariffs the entire time he's been president, and the staff has been trying to stop him from doing what he wants to do, and he finally got it done. But I think that was going to happen at some point anyway. So I'm never sure. His mood is up and down. I'm not sure I really analyze or care. Like the gun thing, he said some things on guns that I don't think are going to happen in law, and I think Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan are going to politely, shoot those things down. Like the people I will be worried if, look at who they left in a big way is General Mattis. If he left, because he runs a big department that can start a war, and he's actually a stabilizing force, is my understanding on Trump's instincts about North Korea and so on. That's the kind of, if Hope Hicks was moderating Trump in the campaign, I'm not sure how effective she was, as Micah was getting at, versus in the administration, the foreign policy has had lots of bluster, but actually most of the time pretty normal actual policy, and those are the people like McMaster, Mattis, Kelly to some extent. If one of those guys leaves, they're the gap between Trump and nuclear wars. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think in the Post article they were linking Mnuchin had been telling people, listen, I've been putting Trump off this tariffs thing he keeps on talking about, and they sort of seem to be linking why this week of all the weeks in the world did he decide to go off on it? And maybe there was some sort of, I don't know. You're right, Perry. It's a total and Micah, you guys are right. It's they're weird stories when you pull back. If we read this 3 years ago,
we'd be like, oh my God.
What?
But that, I guess that's my question. So in the last days of Nixon's administration, there's reporting that suggests he was drinking super heavily, not sleeping, perhaps taking medication, and was just pretty unhinged, right?
And isolated.
And I think we'd want, as an American public, we'd want to know if that were happening, right? But do you guys think there's value? I mean, I do feel like I've read this story, even from the Post. I love the Post, but do you think there's value in these stories that try to capture the mood or that, connect these dots in this way?
I hate to say this about someone's report.